Um, um, we are with the Legislative Fiscal Division. My areas of expertise are K-12 education, so I do analysis for the Office of Public Instruction and then property taxes. And Kurt does the higher education portion of Section E, so the Office of Commissioner of Higher Education, and then also works on property taxes. So I think what we'll do is we will start by going through the property tax resources that we have. And we'll show there are three separate tools that are kind of related to property taxes. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to go to our legislative website. So this is just the leg.mt.gov. And the way that you will navigate to these tools is by going to the Legislative Fiscal Divisions page down here at the bottom. And then under the Welcome to LFD What's New, there is a tab that says the Property Tax Library. So to begin with, there's some background, kind of general background on property taxes that I believe were put together by the Legislative Services Division. So this document goes through just how to calculate property taxes, and which component of the formula is, kind of determined by which entity. It goes through the different methods of reappraisal, different classes of property here, and their various statutory tax rates, and then how mill levies are set. And, one thing I'll note about mill levies, as I'm sure you've seen in the news, there has been quite a bit of discussion around the 95 mills. So generally, when we talk about property taxes, we'll talk about taxing units. And when we say taxing unit, we really mean the entity collecting the taxes. So in the case of the 95 mills, even though they're designated for education, they are collected by the state. But another important thing to note is when you're looking at the property tax model, that the 95 mills aren't the only property taxes collected by the state. So you also have the 6 mill levy for the university system, which is a statewide levy. But then you also have 1.5 mills in 5 counties. So Cascade, Lewis and Clark, Missoula, Silverbow, and Yellowstone. And those are for the vocational technology colleges. So they're collected again by the state. So it's part of the statewide taxing unit, but they're only collected in those 5 counties. Then of course the state, in addition to the state, we have city, county, and local school district levies. So if you live within the city boundaries, whichever county boundaries you live in, you're subject to those property tax levies, and then whatever school district, or school districts, because there can be elementary districts and high school districts that overlap, or you can have a single K-12 district. And all 3 of those entities, the cities, the counties, and the local school districts, have certain caps on their property taxes. They operate differently between local government and school districts. So city and county levies are limited by 1510-420, which has several exceptions. So newly taxable properties not included. There's a list of certain types of mills which are not included. Voted mills are not included in those limits. And then you have school district levies, which are driven by formulas. So there are fewer exceptions to school district levy limits. There are certain ones like school bonds, for instance, for debt service, say to build a new school. That is a voted levy. It is not subject to any of the limits on school district levies. However, those bonds are usually approved not for a specific number of levies or a specific mill levy amount, but for a specific dollar amount. So if you approve a bond of $20 million, your property tax levy is tied to the amount and won't necessarily rise with the taxable value the way it would if it were fixed at 20 mils, say. And then finally, even though these are collected by the county, we separate them into countywide school levies because they're not going to fund actual county government services. They're funding schools at the county level for retirement and transportation costs. And then there are some entities that aren't mentioned here, which we classify as other. There are things like fire districts, lighting districts, road maintenance districts that don't necessarily follow the boundaries of a city or county or school district, but still collect mill levies. Occasionally those will collect fees. And our property tax model at this point does not account for fees. However, we are working on a dashboard to show that kind of missing piece. So property taxes are due for most property in November and May. If you'll recall this year, since most counties voted to levy 79 mills, I think, instead of the 95, that was what was collected in the November payment. For the May payment, they will collect a little bit more than the 95 to account for the discrepancy in November. So between the two payments, 95 mills will be collected, but you'll just have a lower payment in November and a higher payment in May. And then there are some property tax assistance programs which are listed here, which we probably really won't get into a whole lot in this training. The second kind of general document goes over residential property. So again, it's this is just some basic background information, but it talks about a lot of the same things in the previous document, just with a focus on residential property. And so before I launch into the various property tax tools, I'm going to go over some of the background information. So we have several tabs down here with a bit more specific info than in the kind of two general documents up above. There are some documents about the Montana property tax system. Just keep in mind that these were generally either produced for committees or during session at various points in time. And so some of the older ones may not be quite as up to date. Particularly, I'm thinking of anything talking about the 95 mills being deposited into the general fund. That is no longer the case per House Bill 587 from the 2023 session. So beginning at the beginning of this fiscal year, actually, so it was July 1st, any revenue from the 95 mills is now going into the SEPTR account, which is a state special revenue account dedicated to school funding. So that change is in effect now. So anything going forward will show essentially the guarantee account as the first source of school funding, which is about $50 million, varies year to year. Second, the SEPTR account, which will have revenue from the 95 mills. And then third is the backfill from the state general fund. So just keep that in mind if you're looking at some of these older resources. They may not reflect some of the policy changes that have occurred since they were created. However, I think they're still very relevant. They're still very informative. So if you have questions, they are very useful resources for you. And then in addition to some of these reports, we have some presentations that were given to various committees, and some videos clipped from different committee meetings that are useful. I think we've tried to clip them and kind of keep them to shorter chunks. So if you're looking for something specific, it's easier to find. The next tab down, we have national property tax studies, mainly from the Lincoln Institute. Then we have some specific information on cities and counties, so local governments. There's also some information specifically on schools. And as you see, there's a school-specific tool here that we'll go over toward the end of the training today. The other thing I'll note, if you're looking for information on House Bill 587, there is a video from the Revenue Interim Committee in September where Pat McCracken, who's the Legislative Services Division researcher who works on K-12 education. He and I went over House Bill 587 for the Revenue Interim Committee, and so that might be useful if you're wondering how that bill works. Then there is a section on exemptions, abatements, and TIFs. So tax increment financing, that's what TIF means. And that might be relevant because we do talk a little bit about TIFs in the main property tax model. There's a little chunk of TIFs that we are looking at in some of the charts. So if you need some background on that, there's some great background here, especially under TIF basics. Then we have some specific property tax classes. So Kurt has this agricultural property tool down here, which he'll go over again towards the end of this training today. And he's generally just a really great resource for anything kind of property assessment related. He started with us in June and came to us from the property assessment division. And so he knows quite a bit more about different assessment methods than I do. So he's been a great resource for that. And then finally, there's a tab with some related materials, which just has some stuff from the property assessment division, it looks like. So I think.
Are there any questions right off the bat?
Yeah,
Or?
I think that's a great stopping point for a minute.
Yeah. Otherwise, we can jump right into the tool. All right. Yeah, nothing.
Okay. So we'll launch into the main property tax tool. There is actually a link, I believe, to a training here we did in November, very similar to this. So it's a Zoom recording. And I think the one today is going to be recorded and probably posted here as well. So it'll be available for you. There is a tutorial under this one, I believe the schools tool, and maybe there's one coming for the ag tool, I'm not sure. But this is a really great tool if you're working in the model on your own and you're having trouble navigating through it. It kind of shows you where you can click to navigate through the dashboards. It kind of draws attention to the various things that we have on each one of these dashboards. And I'll actually go in and it has some examples towards the end and I'll go over some of those with you. But for the time being, you've got this little pop-out button here that will open the model in full screen mode. So if I do that, and then I want to get out of it, you've got this minimizing button kind of on the bottom right hand corner. The other thing you can do is just hit escape. So we separate our property tax tool into kind of 3 separate categories of dashboards. The first 2 dashboards look at general property tax growth. So we'll look at it first by taxing unit, and then on the second one by class or by tax class. So you've got a number of ways to navigate between the dashboards. You've got these little arrows down here where it says 205. You also have arrows kind of on the bar above it to the left. And then you can use the drop down menu to navigate between the dashboards as well. So this dashboard is really just showing up in the top left hand corner the taxes paid. That's kind of the unit that we're working in each year by taxing unit. So this chart will reflect the full collection of the 95 mills in this statewide taxing unit. Again, keep in mind that statewide includes not only the 95, but also the 6 mil levy and the 1.5 for the 5 counties. But all of them are fixed mills, and so therefore the growth in taxable value is reflected in the growth in taxes paid. If at any point you're having trouble kind of seeing these, they're too small, there is an option here up at the right-hand corner of the graphic to go into focus mode. And what that will do is make this much larger so you can see it better. And then if you hit back to report, it'll take you back to the original report. So at any point you can hover over these graphics and it will give you an amount. They are rounded off here just because there are some minor differences between our numbers and the ones that are in the biennial reports with the Department of Revenue. We are basing our model on data from the Department of Revenue, data from the Office of Public Instruction for schools, and then some local government data from the Department of Administration. But again, we have millions and millions of rows of data in this model with various connections, and Sometimes things just don't quite calculate the exact same way. Generally, we are very, very close to what the Department of Revenue is showing in their annual reports, but sometimes timing of the report pulls or classification issues, such as they don't have a broken out section for junior colleges, and we do. So those are generally included in either counties, countywide education or local schools in their data, depending on how the county chooses to categorize it, which is why we pulled it out to, make it consistent. But there will be some differences like that. If there's anything that looks like it's wildly incorrect, you are more than welcome to, bring it to us. We always are looking for feedback. And, and if it's not an error, we can maybe help you find an explanation for why it looks different. So I guess then I'll move over to this top right hand chart. If we select statewide, just because it's been of interest lately, there will be a chart that shows up here. So any taxing unit that you select will show up as a chart. And we have two measures of growth on this chart in addition to your statewide index. And we're looking at personal income and population and inflation. So we consider population and inflation to be kind of a baseline growth. So essentially, if you weren't making any changes to services, you were just adjusting for population growth and inflation, here is how you would expect things to grow. The personal income line is meant to be more of a measure of growth in the economy. So it's a bit above just the growth in population and inflation. Keep in mind that these are population and inflation and personal income for the state as a whole. So even if you select a county such as Broadwater, it's not adjusting for the personal income in Broadwater County. That is something that we are going to implement. It just takes some time and we haven't had the opportunity to do it yet. So for the time being, those are just fixed regardless of what county you select or municipality. But if you notice on the statewide level, up until 2023, the growth in the statewide taxing unit, so again, the 95, the 6, and 1.5 mils, followed pretty closely with population and inflation. But with the reappraisal jump in fiscal year 2024, it bumped up quite a bit in 2024, slightly above that personal income line. If I deselect statewide and we go back here, you'll notice on the bottom right-hand side of the screen, we have a chart that shows the taxable value growth and the taxes paid. So you can see the jump in taxable value in fiscal year 2024. There's also a bit of a jump in taxes paid, but it's not quite as dramatic. And that's because of a lot of the limits on budgetary growth, whether it's through 1510-420 for cities and counties, or for budget limits for school districts. That essentially caused certain mills, again, if they were voted for a specific number of mills, they don't count, but certain mills that have limited budgetary growth, those mills would float down. So again, you saw an increase, but again, not quite as dramatic as the increase in taxable value. And if you look at an entity like the statewide entity, it's a bit more reflected there. Again, it's a smaller portion of the total, but you can see this jump is very reflected here. We also show the compound annual growth rates. So the 8-year compound annual growth rate is going to be from 2016 to 2024. So it's kind of an average percentage growth rate over that time period. The CAGR, or compound annual growth rate, year over year is really showing the difference between 2023 and 2024. So essentially what this is saying is that between 2016 and 2024, the statewide taxing unit grew at about 7.5%. But in the most recent year, it grew 28.3% about. And then if you filter to, say, a specific county, let's say we pick on Broadwater County again, the charts will update to reflect what's going on in Broadwater County, and so will the compound annual growth rates. And say you've picked Yellowstone County, it's all the way at the bottom, and you don't want to scroll down, you can use the little eraser here to clear selections. You can also select, say, Cascade County, and if you go to municipalities, it will filter to the ones in Cascade County. So City of Great Falls, Town of Belt, Town of Cascade. And so you can choose to select the county, you can choose to select Cascade, and again, the charts will update. And then you can use those erasers to clear your selections. So on the second dashboard, we're looking at the exact same data, only this time we'll look at it by tax class instead of by taxing unit. Montana has about 15, I think, tax classes. And so to keep these charts clean, we have combined some of the smaller ones into other.
Mhm.
So they're listed over here on the right-hand side. There are a number of, again, of the smaller tax classes, as you can see, are down here in comparison to the total. So we've tried to separate out the kind of big ones or the ones of interest, such as residential property, commercial property, pipelines and electrical, business equipment, and then we've combined ag and forest here into one, even though they are separate classes. Down below, you can see the percentages of the totals. You can see the jump in residential as a percentage of the taxes paid between fiscal year 2023 and 2024. And you can also see that not as a percentage, but as a dollar amount here on the line chart. Again, you have your compound annual growth rates. You can see that it was a bit higher for residential. And then you have the percentages shown as a pie chart here. And again, you have the same options to just look at residential or to look at a specific county and see the differences. And there are some differences between counties. You have a county like, say, Madison, which is pretty heavily residential. You'll see that here, you know, it's almost over 85% residential versus a county like Carter County, which is more heavily class 9 pipelines and electrical. So the tax base does make a difference when we talk about growth rates here. Are there any questions on these two dashboards before we go to the next two? There aren't any questions, I will move on. So the next two dashboards look at new and existing property, again, by tax unit and by tax class. So what we're looking at here on the bottom left-hand side is a bar chart with this big gray chunk at the bottom, and the gray chunk is essentially the prior year's taxes paid. So it's just what you're seeing from the previous year, and then the colored amounts on top are what's changed, are the new amount, the difference. And so because they're hard to see, again, you can use the focus mode to pop out and look at them, but they can still be kind of small and difficult to see. We've separated them out into their own chart. So this is just the growth on top of the prior year's amount. And if we look at this here, you can get a better picture of what's negative growth or essentially a decrease, what's positive and the amounts, and some of these really skinny kind of sections here, like the TIF amount in 2019, show up a little better in focus mode. So again, if you have questions about TIFs, those TIF resources are great. So then essentially on the right-hand side of this screen, we've taken the growth in either existing property or in new property and broken it out by taxing unit. So this top right-hand graph is essentially the forest green, the existing property, broken out by taxing unit. And similarly, the one on the bottom is essentially the tan newly taxable broken out by taxing unit. So up top here, you'll notice that in 2018, there was quite the bump for local schools. And that's due to a couple of factors. The first one is the expiration of school district block grants that were funded by the state. When those expired, local school districts had to replace those with local property tax revenue. So that's where that big bump, part of that big bump comes from in 2018. The second cause of that is a number of school construction projects were voted upon in 2018 and 2019. So I believe for 2019, Gallatin County's, or it was Gallatin County, but Bozeman High School District built a new high school. And so that was accounted for in this kind of bigger chunk from schools in 2019. In 2018, I think East Helena built or voted to build their new high school. Townsend K-12 bonded for some big maintenance and construction projects for their schools. And so across the state, some of these kind of school infrastructure votes kind of all happened to hit right in 2018, and that's causing that bump in conjunction with the expiration of school district block grants. You'll notice in 2024, the bump in residential property definitely is reflected here. You can see that statewide taxing unit accounts for about half the increase. And that's just on existing property. If we look at taxes from new property, you'll notice they're proportional pretty much year to year. So even though the amount varies, the percentage that goes to, say, the counties tends to be pretty consistent. And that's just because when you build a new home in a jurisdiction, you are paying the same, the same amounts compared to your value that your neighbor's going to pay, because your mills are the same. And so new property is going to come onto the tax rolls proportional to the kind of needs and decisions that have already been made in that local jurisdiction, versus the tax increases on existing property are kind of responding to needs or decisions that make changes, such as school infrastructure votes. The fourth dashboard is going to show you the exact same view, again, new and existing property, but this time by tax class. So you've got the same chart that you saw on the previous slide, only now we're looking at it by tax class. So again, you can see in 2018, that schools bump was funded with residential property primarily. That's probably just a function of the fact that a lot of the places that had school construction projects are heavily residential areas, such as Bozeman. In 2024, obviously the residential tax bump is a result of the reappraisal increase that was particularly high for residential property. And so you can actually see that existing residential taxpayers had an increase, and some of the other tax classes actually saw a decrease, such as pipelines and electrical, which again includes the group of tax classes that you see listed here on the right-hand side. And then business equipment and ag and forest also received a bit of a reduction. And then you can see the effect of the taxes from new property by tax class here as well. Are there any questions on these two dashboards? I think I will proceed then. So the final property tax dashboard that we have is a map, and this shows effective tax rate. Effective tax rate is really defined as the percentage of the tax bill that's paid on a property as a percentage of the assessed value. So we generally have been talking about things in terms of taxable values on the previous slides. Now we're talking in terms of assessed value. So that's essentially the value that the Department of Revenue determines your property is worth before the statutory tax rates are applied to it. As you can see, statewide for residential property, which is selected here, the effective tax rate is about 0.66%. It will look higher for different classes of property, and that's because the residential tax rate, you take your assessed value and you multiply it by 1.35%. That is an amount that is determined in statute and can only be changed by the legislature. For pipelines and electrical utilities, that statutory tax rate is 12%. So instead of taking their assessed value and multiplying by 1.35%, they multiply by 12%. And so you'll notice when I select this, that the effective tax rate is a bit higher because that statutory tax rate is different. And one thing I just want to note is this mapping software is really slow, particularly when you have all these really small pieces of the map where these are levy districts, because it's going off a custom built map and not just the counties. It takes several seconds to update once you've clicked something. So if you click something, give it about 5 to 10 seconds to make some changes. And then if If it hasn't changed, you can try again. But if you double click, it'll then unselect whatever you've clicked. So just be patient. We are working on a way to make this a bit more efficient, but haven't had any luck so far. So you'll notice on this map that you have a bunch of white areas. Those are going to be levy districts that don't contain whatever tax class you've selected. So pipelines and electrical utilities just don't exist in some of these white areas. If I go back to residential, again, give it a minute to update, it'll change the map here. You'll notice there are far fewer sections on the map that show up as plain white. And so generally what those will be, I think there's one that only exists in the middle of Flathead Lake that shows up as white for good reason. There's no residential property in the middle of the lake in that section. Or, maybe it's all national forest land or all reservation land, or it's a really small levy district that only has one parcel of property that's classified as something different, commercial, say. So that does happen, and it's to be expected. The other thing you can do here is zoom in on an individual county. So say we want to select Beaverhead County, the effective tax rate here on the left-hand side will actually adjust to show you the effective tax rate for Beaverhead County alone. Again, it's updating. So it'll zoom in then on Beaverhead County. And you can get a more in-depth look at the different levy districts. Again, you can hover over them to see the specific effective tax rate in that levy district. So for this one, it's 0.65 versus the average for Beaverhead County is about 0.67%. And I know the boundaries of these look kind of funny. So essentially what these levy districts are is the unique overlap of every taxing jurisdiction. So you take the county boundaries, you take city boundaries, you take school district boundaries, elementary and high school districts, you take your boundaries of your fire districts, your road maintenance districts, and all these districts overlapped on one another create a unique section of overlap where essentially every single property in that levy district pays the same mills. So that's why they're different sizes, because often the city boundaries are smaller. The more rural levy districts tend to be a little bit larger, just because they have, fewer special districts, say they don't have city boundaries. But that's why you end up with some that are really like weird and small. Maybe that's a fire district that, or a city boundary that creates another unique levy district. And so again, if you want to clear the selections, you can use the eraser and it will go back to the statewide amount. If anyone has any questions on this, please let me know. Otherwise, I think we'll proceed. Oh, it looks like someone has a question.
Oh, yeah. Senator Shelley? Senator Vance, please.
Julie, could you please go back? I think it's dashboard 3.
Mhm.
I'm pretty sure that's when it was. I'm sorry, I couldn't get my hands raised and lowered and all that stuff fast enough.
Yeah.
But there was I'm pretty sure it's on dashboard number 3. I have a question about, let's see, is that yes, good, that's when it is. So the taxing units we have listed, junior colleges. Now, though, could you explain to me what the junior colleges are? Those aren't those 5 that were in the statewide, are they? Or are they?
That is correct. So the 5 that are in the statewide taxing unit, again, they're not included in this junior colleges one. I believe there are only a few that are included here. I believe you have Flathead Valley Community College.
Gallatin College is in there.
Gallatin College is in there. I think there's one in Dawson County.
Mm-hmm.
There's maybe 5 statewide. So you'll notice there are certain counties that you'll select that won't have junior colleges at all. Beaverhead might be one of those. So yeah, I don't think if you pop this one out, it won't have any navy blue, but if you look at, say, Flathead County, you will see there's some navy for Flathead Valley Community College. And then if you look at, say, Lewis and Clark County, which has which is one of the 5 where it's collected at the statewide level, you're not gonna see it here because again, the 1.5 mils for Helena College are included in statewide.
Okay, so, if I could, please, I was gonna ask follow-up, sorry about that.
Yeah, go for it.
Not a committee hearing, but anyway,
Mhm.
so is there any way to get a list of those junior colleges? Or is there someplace here where you can click on and you'll know the junior colleges are different than the, um, oh, I forget what they're called, like Lewis and Clark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have that
So
anywhere?
we have a list of the junior colleges. I don't think they're found anywhere on the website, but it might be something that we can just add a note, on this dashboard somewhere that the junior colleges are, Flathead Valley Community College, Gallatin College, etc. And note that the ones in the 5 counties that are included in the statewide taxing unit are different. Or we can potentially put a resource on the website for that.
Can
But
you
I
tell
don't think
me?
it's listed yet.
I'm sorry, it's probably just because of when they were established, but what
Mhm.
is the difference between the two?
I think the ones that are included in junior colleges, for whatever reason, like Gallatin College is
It
newer,
is
right?
newer and it was not included in the VOTEC mills.
Yeah, I'm guessing and again, this is, I'm not 100% on this, but I would guess it's because those 5 counties are the ones that originally had junior colleges and they were lumped in the statewide taxing unit. And as other counties, built or got junior colleges, they were split out separately. And I don't know why that is, but I can definitely find some additional information for you if you like.
Yeah, I think it would be good for
Mhm.
a lot of people when we're having this discussion about property taxes, and then we do the statewide, and then as an example, I'm talking to people in Gallatin County, and our junior. Thank you, Kurt, for saying VOTEC. That's the word. That's what I forgot the terminology, but the VOTECs are basically kind of the original ones that were done with the statewide possibly. I'm saying this, describing this, explaining this quite sloppily. I realize, I'm sorry about that. And then the junior colleges are probably the newer ones that have been voted in and established.
That would be my
Yeah,
guess.
I'd imagine.
We can certainly follow up on that with you.
Thanks so much. Sorry to take so much time. Thank you.
No, not
No,
at all.
that's what this is for. If there aren't any other questions, I'm gonna proceed down to the schools tab and we'll go over the schools tool really briefly. Oh, and one more thing actually, before we move on to that, there is a BI tutorial here. Again, I think I showed you that earlier, which has some great examples on new and existing properties. So if you scroll down, it walks you through how to use all the dashboards, but there's a section down here that says general examples. And then it has some titles showing you different types of examples. So the ones that might be interesting, particularly for the local government committee members who are going to meet and revenue interim committee members who are having a joint meeting, I believe on Tuesday. The new and existing property tabs have some interesting examples where, say here in Hill County, there's actually a couple examples of new taxes paid by new property being high enough to buy down taxes on existing properties. You can see that kind of negative existing property in comparison to the positive increases on newly taxable. And that happens particularly in non-reappraisal years, so the odd years. And generally you'll see those buy downs within countywide education mills and local school district mills, just because of the more strict budget caps on those types of mills, the school related ones. Again, local governments like cities and counties have restrictions. They're just not quite as specific as the ones for school districts. And then you have an example in Dawson County here where you can actually have negative changes to taxes paid from the state for existing property if there's a value reduction. So again, because the mills are fixed, they're tied to the taxable value. So if value is reduced, so will those property taxes paid. And then you have an interesting example here, which doesn't happen very often, but does happen, where cities and towns can choose to offset existing property taxes with taxes from new property, which isn't required, but again, it does occur, as we can see here. So one other important thing to note about new and existing property is that the way we treat newly taxable property in this model is different than the way it's treated by the Department of Revenue. So for their purposes, it's basically a net total. They kind of zero out the negatives for the 15, 10, 4, 20 budgetary limit calculation. But for our purposes, when we're looking at taxes paid, say if you have something like business equipment that moves from Lewis and Clark County to Cascade County, it's going to be zeroed out in Lewis and Clark County for your 15, 10, 4, 20 calc, and it'll count in Cascade County as new property. But for our purposes, for calculating taxes paid, not the budget limit calculation, but the actual taxes paid, that property no longer exists in Lewis and Clark County. And so we account for the negatives in a way that again, 15, 10, 4, 20 calculation does not. And so it's a little bit different. And so that's why some things with newly taxable won't necessarily match up between us and the Department of Revenue. Are there any other questions on that? Okay.
Seeing none.
So we'll jump into the schools tool. I'm going to try to be really quick on this so Kurt has time to go over his ag land use tool. But again, there's a tutorial here. So if you go and look at it, it has this brochure that was produced by the Legislative Services Division that talks about how school funding for the district general fund works. And again, it goes through and shows how to navigate some of these examples. So I'm going to jump into the tool. You have kind of two separate looks at school funding. And again, we are looking specifically at the school district general fund. There are about 7 other funds, maybe 8, might even be 9 or 10, that receive, that are budgeted funds that can receive property taxes. So you've got like the building reserve fund, which is for major maintenance projects. It receives major maintenance from the state, in addition to some voted property tax levies. And I believe there are some options for permissive ones there too. You also have a debt service fund for each individual school district, which of course is for those major construction projects, and those are not included here. So the general fund is really talking about the day-to-day operations of a school district, the salaries, the energy bill, the resources, the paper for printers. It's kind of the general operation budget. And so you can look at this going back to 2017, and you can also look at it by school district. There's a measure here that shows A and B, which is enrollment. And it's not exactly equal to number of students. It's an enrollment metric, but it's pretty darn close. So on this first dashboard, these various green pieces are not actually how the budget is funded for the school districts. This is showing how the lines on the bucket for school funding are drawn. So because of certain lawsuits over the years, there are adequacy and equity requirements that you can see in this kind of school funding formula for how to draw these limits. The base budget, I think, is a result of an adequacy lawsuit, and the maximum budget is a result of, I believe, one of those equity lawsuits. And so basically it's saying that just because you're a district that has more property tax wealth or other wealth, you can't pay, $7 million per kid to fund your schools when other districts are limited at 10,000, right? Like there's kind of a band in there that school districts have to stay between. There are a few exceptions for going over the maximum budget that are generally due to declining enrollment. But again, it's not like budgets are funded at double max. It's only a slight amount over max. So this is how the lines on the bucket are drawn. The second dashboard shows how they are filled up. So kind of starting from the bottom, we have fully state funded components. So there are 5 of them. They're for the quality educator payment, the at-risk payment, Indian Education for All, the American Indian Achievement Gap, and Data for Achievement. So those are all fully funded by the state. Then you have some special education, and then you have direct state aid coming from the state. So there's a per A and B entitlement, so again, kind of per student, and then there's a per district entitlement in there as well that depends on the size of the district. And type of district. I believe it's like elementary or high school district. And then there's also state aid that's called guaranteed tax base aid. And this is more of the equalization mechanism to get every single district up to base. So all districts that are funded at base or above. But essentially on top of these 3 state funded components is what we call the GTB area. So this is filled up with non-levy revenue that can be from oil and gas, fund balance reappropriated. So essentially anything left over from last year, property taxes, the stuff that goes toward the base budget, which is a required property tax levy, and then guaranteed tax base aid from the state. So all districts receive these 3 green components at the bottom. Not all districts receive GTB. So if you're a district like Ennis K-12, which the tax base for Ennis K-12 includes the Yellowstone Club, they don't receive any GTB aid from the state. And again, because they're a residential heavy district, they're funded primarily with local property taxes from that residential property from the Yellowstone Club. The other thing to note is that even if you're a school district that maybe has a pretty significant property tax base, but you have a lot of kids, you have more, more of a funding need, right? Like in Ennis, they're funding 442 kids versus in Bozeman, say Bozeman High School, we're looking at 3,000, almost 3,000 kids for just for the high school district. And so as a result, pretty much all the big 7, Helena, Bozeman, Missoula, Billings, Great Falls, Butte, and Kalispell, all of those like the major school districts in those cities receive GTB aid. And that's again, because that's where most of the students are. And that's what we're funding, right, is kids. And then it's also because they're being the largest, they're driving the statewide average. So again, most of them will receive GTB aid, but it's not as much as some other districts. Say if we look at Browning, which is a reservation district, most of that GTB area is filled up with GTB aid from the state. And again, they're only funded at base. So they have some property taxes. You'll never see a district that doesn't have anything in here because GTB is a per mill subsidy. So you have to have some buy-in from local property taxpayers to get GTB aid. But then you can have a district like Lambert High School, which is in Richland County, and their GTB area is filled up almost entirely with non-levy revenue from oil and gas, so near the oil fields. And then some fund balance reappropriated. But their overbase area, again, is filled up with pretty much all non-levy revenue. So as I said before, anything up to base, especially in the property tax area, is required. This is a required property tax levy. Everyone has to get up to base. The overbase area is an optional voted property tax levy. So I believe Bozeman High School District and Elementary District both just in 2022 put general fund overbase levies out to their voters, which were approved. So in this area, those levies are voted. In this area, they're required. And again, there's some extra information here about these various funding components. You can also see them in the table, and they are in the same order as the legend and also in the same order as the stack. So if you're having trouble distinguishing between the colors, which we've been trying to switch to be more colorblind friendly, but we're still tweaking our color scheme, kind of as needed. You can always either hover over the amount or you can look at the amount here. And again, they're in the exact same order as the chart and the legend. So the third dashboard really is a comparison dashboard, and I've actually made some changes to this. We'll roll them out hopefully relatively soon to show not only the A and B, but also the taxable value, and then be able to compare years as well here. But for the time being, what you're doing is comparing the statewide total, so this chart is fixed and won't change, to a specific school district. So you can see how this district is over max, probably has some declining enrollment, and you can see how they compare. And then finally, on the last dashboard, we have a map showing those individual school districts. So say you don't know where, or you don't know what school districts are in Broadwater County. You can click on it again, give it a minute to load. And it'll update and show you, oops, see, I didn't give it enough time to load, I unclicked. It will show you the enrollment for the county and then also the total district general fund budget for that county. So this really is an interesting case where it's a single school district for the entire county, because you can see all the school districts here. On the other hand, if we were to look at, say, a school district, you don't know where Anaconda Elementary is, it will highlight that school district for you. So the elementary and K-12 districts are shown at the top, the high school and K-12 are shown at the bottom. So if you select a K-12 district, it will show up on both. If you select an elementary or high school, it shows up on its respective map. And that's just because the elementary and high school districts overlap one another. But if you're wondering what county Anaconda Elementary is in, sometimes this isn't perfect because school districts can be in multiple counties, but you can go and it'll show you it's in Deer Lodge County. So as far as the school district tool goes, that's all I have for you. Are there questions?
Any questions?
Okay. So I think with that, we will go down to specific property tax classes, and this is Kurt's agricultural land tool.
Thank you.
Swap up.
Switch through. All right, and this is a tool that we developed. There are some questions on some land valuation and basic land use in Montana. We developed this through data that we collected provided from the Property Assessment Division of the Department of Revenue. And it basically was just data of all the different land parcels in Montana, what the Department of Revenue classifies those land parcels as, and what the assessed values of some of these land parcels are. So we have several dashboards. We have not updated it for fiscal year 2024 at this point, but you can go through previous fiscal years, fiscal year 16 through 23, and see a lot of look into information that you would like to. So you can see on this first dashboard right here, we have the total market value. So this is going to be the total assessed value that is put out for the Department of Revenue before they do the calculation that multiplies it by tax rates, which turns values into taxable values by land class. This is just, the assessment of mostly fair market and appraised value for different land classes. So you can see right here, for example, that residential use land makes up the majority of the total assessed market value here in Montana, followed by commercial land, then agricultural land, and then forest land, and then this little bit section right here, which is non-qualified agricultural land. If anybody's not familiar with this, non-qualified agricultural land is a bit of an odd case in land classification, where the land might not necessarily meet the requirements for complete agricultural land use. But they are parcels that are between 20 and 160 acres in size for the most part. And for whatever reason, their use case they're not producing enough income from agricultural products to meet the qualifications for agricultural land. But also because of the parcel size are not automatically qualified as residential land either. They also specifically need to be not commercial in use to qualify as non-qualified agricultural land. And there's some they're a bit of an interesting case of land type right here but they are appraised at the average productivity rate with agricultural land. There are some resources that I can show you later if you're curious about how some of these different land classes end up being assessed and how they're valued. But a lot of this tool also functions similarly to the previous tools we've showed you earlier. This one right here just shows you the breakdown of different counties and different classes within a county. But if we want to zoom in and look at, say, Cascade County, for example, you can see that we can just select that and we can see the breakdown of values of land within Cascade County as well. You can also zoom in on a specific land class. Say if I really wanted to look into forest land right here, but it's too small in this main screen for me to see, I can just select the forest land filter right here and see more in depth where a lot of the value of our forest land are. And as you can see right here, oh, we're seeing a lot more of these land classes over on the western side of the state. Now this map down here is an attempt to look at the average assessed market value per acre. So this is an attempt to break down the typical per acre values and where they occur throughout the state. This is only taking samples of 15 to 25 acre parcels, as those are the land sizes where we have a pretty good sized sample and a good overlap of a lot of parcels. You're not really going to see in many cases of ag land that are less than an acre. Those tend to be over, over 20 certainly, and most of them are over 160 acres in size. And conversely, you don't see a lot of residential land that is, you don't see any residential land that is over 160 acres because that's just qualified as agricultural land. But you can zoom in here and look at different counties to see, okay, if I'm just going to focus on residential land, where is the most valuable residential land typically throughout the state? And you can see that for this example, we're seeing Gallatin County is highlighted very much, but we also see that it tends to be more valuable closer to and around some of the more populated areas. Flathead County, Missoula County, Wilson Clark County is a little darker than some of the other ones. Yellowstone County highlights as well. So you can explore that if you'd like to there. On the second page, here it's very similar to the previous one, but we're looking instead at taxable value. So instead of looking at the assessed value before tax rates are applied, we look at the taxable values after those tax rates are applied. And you can notice, I zoomed out a little more than I meant to there, but you can notice that non-qualified agricultural land, which was barely showing up at the assessed value stage, is now a lot larger of a portion of this pie. This is because we have a very high tax rate for non-qualified agricultural land. So even though it's a smaller assessed portion value, we can see that that increases the size of its taxable value relative to each other classes. Otherwise, this page functions more or less the same as the previous one, but you can get into some differences there if you're curious about what the tax rates do to these different values and how that occurs throughout Montana. You can also look at this third page right here where we're not looking at value, but the previous two pages look at assessed value and market value. Here we're just looking at like different parcels and where the acreage is. And we see a very different picture here in Montana where we see that, okay, even though that agricultural land was not taking up that much of a assessed value or taxable value in terms of the value of the land, you see a lot more acreage of this land that's classified as agricultural. Now, it may not necessarily be agricultural in use because there's a lot of, again, I can show you a resource in a bit here of where you can go into details of how land is classified. Some agricultural, all parcels of land that are over 160 acres end up being classified as agricultural, regardless if they're actually used to produce agriculture or any products or not. But you can see that we see a lot more of this land is being used there. And you can see that we have, a lot of acreage of agricultural land and a lot of acres of assessed land in general over in this eastern part of the state, where we see a lot fewer commercial and residential land specifically, which is, a little bit interesting, especially considering that they comprise a lot of the value of land in our previous states or the previous pages. Otherwise, this functions very similarly. And this last page, it's a bit different. We tried to take a look at just some general trends, looking at agricultural, forest, and non-qualified agricultural land. Specifically, we're trying to look at some land use changes. And to be honest, we don't have a ton of information here, and we're not quite there in terms of being able to generate a lot of great insight into what's going on here. But you can, if you want to have specific questions about how land is classified, either statewide or in a specific county, you can look at different trends, maybe of agricultural land classification, forest classification, or non-qualified agricultural classification. And then you can zoom into a specific county as well. One thing that I should note is that land classification can change from year to year. So for example, if an agricultural piece of land ends up being subdivided into a bunch of small parcels and sold off as a subdivision, that land changes its classification from agricultural to residential or commercial in that case. So we don't have a lot of detail on those fine grain land use changes yet. We're hoping to get there. But if you have some general questions, you can look at this and it might be helpful. Please feel free to reach out with any questions you might have, and we can try to look into that as well. Before I take questions, the other two resources I want to point out here are there are a lot of resources for land classification and specifically agricultural land classification put out by the LFD, the Legislative Service Division, and the Department of Revenue as well, that should go into depth of how land is classified and then some of the oddities of land classification and land valuation there. So they're great resources if you want to dive deeper, have more questions regarding there. I think that's all I have. Are there any questions that I can take now? Right, seeing none, I think that more or less wraps up our presentation. Ms. Julie, I think if there's anything else we should cover.
Nope. If you have any questions, just feel free to reach out. We're constantly working on these tools, so we'll be rolling out updates to them as they're suggested and as we can, make them work. So I know one of the questions that I got was on that school district comparison tool to have some more options. So hopefully we'll roll that out. And then we're also working on a tool that will allow us to show some changing parameters for the residential statutory tax rate. So that's that 1.35% to be able to, see what happens if you adjust it up or down, see what happens if you adjust the 95 mils up or down, and then see what happens if you change the GTB ratio. So the GTB ratio will affect which districts are eligible for GTB aid, which of course is offsetting local property taxes in that kind of base area of school funding. And so that's a tool that we've had requested from multiple legislators, multiple committees, to be able to look at how those three things interact, and it's incredibly complicated. So we're hoping to be able to roll that out, or at least a preview of it, to the Revenue Interim Committee next week on Tuesday. It probably won't be published as a dashboard for a bit, because we'd like to make sure that it's working correctly and that we're vetting it properly. But it is something that we are working very hard on. And again, some of the changes to the other dashboards, we're constantly updating data and taking your suggestions into account. So if you have any suggestions, things you'd like to be able to see, or questions, feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you. And I guess as a reminder, this was recorded and we will be posted at some point in the future as well. And we'll send out a link to some committee members.
Yeah, hopefully tonight or maybe tomorrow it'll be posted. And so if you want to recap it, or if anyone wants to watch it ahead of committee meetings, it'll be available. Thank you, Rep. Seffer.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. A lot of information.
Thank you, Representative Bertoglio.
Have a good one.
You too.
You as well.